model's made up of a bunch of matrices, right? So you have the weight delta matrix at any given point. You can be like, all right, well, here's how the weights changed between the original base model and the model that is the reasoning model. What you find when you study those matrices using something called singular value decomposition, which sounds complicated, but if you know linear algebra, you're like, oh man, really, that simple thing? It's really a way of breaking down your matrix. It allows you to tell how much actual information that matrix contains, roughly speaking, right? Like, is it, like, yes, I get that it's a grid of 100 by 100, but are some of those values kind of like copies of each other? Is there redundancy in that matrix, or is it truly like fully independent values that all of them matter? And what they find here is when you look at those weight delta matrices, in other words, the matrices that tell you how the reasoning model is different from the base model, they don't contain that much information. There's only a small number of dimensions that actually bring value, bring information in that context. And that's going to be the first hint that, hey, wait a minute, maybe we can radically reduce the dimensionality that we use to fine-tune our models. Maybe we can introduce these LoRa adapters, which essentially, this is like you have your input that comes into a layer, it gets processed, say, by a matrix. Well, what LoRa lets you do is, right next to that matrix, in parallel, so you'll freeze the original regular matrix, and then you'll create this like little adapter neural network that kind of takes your input, projects it to a really small latent space, like a tiny latent space, and then expands it back out to be the same dimensionality as the regular matrix. And then you combine them together. That's what LoRa does. So the question is, how narrow is that bottleneck in the LoRa part of that show? And it turns out that they can make it really, really, really tiny, to the point where, roughly speaking, there are 13 parameters that they can use to capture 90% of the performance on reasoning tasks that you get from a fully fine-tuned reasoning model. That is wild, right? And it's 13 parameters, not at every layer, 13 parameters for the whole model. So the math behind how that happens, I wish we had more time to get into it, actually, because it is kind of interesting, but the fundamentals are 13 numbers actually seem to be sufficient to capture 90% of the reasoning capabilities of the model, which very much seems to suggest that all RL is doing is it's allowing you to not create new capabilities in your model, but rather elicit capabilities that are already there. This is yet another piece of evidence in that direction.
And worth mentioning the specific 13 parameter number that is specifically for Qwen 2.5-7b-instruct. So this is a smaller amount for a smaller model. The claim they make in the paper is that you can get to this smaller amount of needed updates through RL. Basically, RL makes it much more efficient than supervised fine-tuning, which is what you would do typically with LoRa. So you can get orders of magnitude fewer parameter updates. Now, for more complex benchmarks, you do need more than 13 parameters, so this is a very specific example for the 13. But the general thing is, it's possible to be even more efficient and get most of the benefit that you would get from training more models.
And the next paper is Reinforcement World Model Learning for LLM-based Agents. This is really interesting as a paradigm. So basically, one option you have if you want to do reinforcement learning, train your model to perform well in some text-based environment. Think a text-based game, right? Or one benchmark they use here is AlphaWorld. It's basically household tasks. And you've got this text-based game engine that simulates a house with rooms, objects, and physics and all that. So you can send commands like, go to countertop 1 or take knife 1, right? And the environment is going to update its internal state, and it gives you observations like, you have arrived at countertop 1, and on countertop 1 you see a mug, a knife, like all this stuff. Basically, it's a text-based adventure game with consistent rules about where the objects are and what happens when you interact with the environment. And so normally you would have a goal that you're going to train your model to perform on, to execute against, to chase some reward in that environment. The problem is the vast majority of the time, your agent is going to fail. The vast majority of trajectories fail to reach any given goal. And so it's very sort of time consuming for your model to actually get any kind of grip, any kind of leverage in the environment. And so what they're going to do here is say, okay, well, wait a minute. There's actually a lot more information contained in environments like this than we are taking advantage of when we only myopically focus on a certain kind of goal. Instead, what we could do is have the agent just kind of like go and do a bunch of random shit, open drawers, pick up mugs, all that stuff, and then try to get the agent to predict the next thing, the next state of the environment as a result, and just like, see what happens. And so essentially this gives you a series of, like, if the agent takes a bunch of actions and sees a bunch of next states, you end up with a bunch of states, actions, and next states, a bunch of like those bundles that you can use to train the model to just predict how the environment is going to evolve. So basically do random actions in the environment. You don't have to be smart to do it. You just like bump into something and notice, oh shit, I bumped into something. So now you know, okay, if I walk up to the table and don't stop, I'm going to bump into it. Cool. That is a state, action, and next state. And then what you can do is just train your model on a whole bunch of those. You're never actually using it to pursue an objective yet. You're just using kind of free information about the physics of the environment that is available, again, for free in the environment. And so agents are trained essentially just to like to do this. You basically take the model you're going to train, have it interact with the environment, convert all those interaction histories into trajectories, and you get rid of samples like trajectories that are too straightforward, and the best simple way of doing that. But then you train the language model to predict what happens after taking action based on those trajectories, and then you switch over to rewarding predictions based on what you're after, fundamentally. So the cool thing is you actually don't need good trajectories to learn good world models. You just need like diversity in your interactions, and even a terrible policy that would screw up like 80% of the time still creates like thousands of valid state transitions, right? That you can then use to learn the physics of the environment. So really, really cool paper, a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how we can squeeze more value out of our environments.
And this is kind of a meta comment. I've found a lot of the RL for LLMs papers kind of rhyme with RL for robotics papers in a way that isn't.
Yeah.
So like self-play or learning from play rather was the thing in robotics where you just bump around and you can learn the dynamics of the environment. Yeah, anyway, there's a lot of comparisons to be made with the papers being published for RL, for LLMs, to things that people have been doing in RL for robotics going back a decade. Fun comparison.
That's a great point. Yeah, so true.
And just two more papers to cover a little quickly, or not papers so much, maybe research results. Opus 4.6 on vending bench. So this was a fun result with the release of Opus. One of the kind of details is there is a benchmark called vending bench where the model is supposed to make money with a vending machine. And Opus 4.6 did a really good job. It achieved an average balance of over $8,000, which the early models of this completely sucked. So the fact that newer models, not just Opus 4.6, but newer models in general, are doing better on this is a hint that they might, again, are capable of doing more real, impactful things in the real world.
Yeah, it's, this is a complicated benchmark to assess because it is a simulated market. So, you don't actually have intelligent agents kind of interacting in the way that we would following, real incentives. But yeah, it's pretty impressive. One of the things that does not happen with Opus 4.6 as much is the doom loop cycle that is a big issue for a lot of these models, where when a model will order like products or something, and there's some email that'll come back from a supplier saying, hey, it'll arrive on February 15th. Model wakes up on February 15th, tries to restock before items arrive, and then gets an error message, and then it starts to flip out, and it starts to like threaten, like one of the quotes is like total nuclear legal intervention, that sort of thing. So sure, less of an issue, 4.6. A lot of interesting failure modes you can look at from typical models in these cases. But bottom line is, yeah, this is an interesting benchmark, and it does a lot better on it.
And there's some fun details on what it's doing. Apparently the system prompt is do whatever it takes to maximize your bank account balance after 1 year of operation. And in his benchmark, Claude decides to be a little sneaky sometimes. It's like, okay, I'm going to promise you a refund, but not give you a refund. Refusing refunds, so it does hint also at a safety piece. And by the way, Opus 4.6 also interesting in that it is much less sycophantic, seemingly. People posted some examples of it being like a little mean or a little confrontational. in a way that other cloud models and certainly other ChatGPT models just aren't. And speaking of new benchmark results, we've got to touch on Netter and the work horizon, the latest on that from the new models. So one of the things that people look at, I guess, more than anything with model releases or up there as far as what people pay attention to is the length of work according to this Netter evaluation that models are capable of. So far, the trend has been that we are seeing pretty rapid acceleration from just a few minutes in 2024 towards hours at a time. We saw an improvement of GPT-5, and now with Claude and GPT 5.2, once again, we saw a significant improvement that seems to track with the prediction that it might be exponential. Opus 4.5, GPT 5.2 high, both jumped up in the predictions towards multiple hours by a pretty decent amount.
Yeah, and I'm gonna front load all the usual objections to the meter eval thing. Like, we get it. These are based on a very small set of human done tasks. And no, it's not obvious that we know technically or can assess tasks or that it even makes sense to talk about tasks that it takes a single human 80 hours to do, because those aren't well defined. Usually when tasks get that long, they involve the collaboration of many humans and AI, all that stuff. However, one thing that we can say is not only do things seem to be on track on the 50% success rate threshold. So this is the classic meter eval plot that everyone's used to seeing. It answers the question roughly, what is the length of a task that an AI system can do what is the length of a task that it would take a human to do? How much time that it would take a human to do that task? How long did that task have to get before an AI system has a 50-50 success rate at that task, right? So make your task more complex and longer, and eventually success rate goes down, eventually you hit 50%. So there's also an 80% time horizon chart. That also looks consistent if you look at GPT 5.2 high, so you're also on trend there. But we had some cases with previous models where they do really well in the 50% plot, but then drop a lot on the 80%. The other thing that we can say about this is, if you look at this plot, you may actually notice a dislocation around the time of OpenAI's 01. I believe, at this point, I'll just say I believe that the curve is actually steepening. I believe that this doubling time that we're seeing from Meter is actually increasingly starting to look like it's doubling faster than every 7 months, maybe closer to every 4 months or so. I don't mean to toot any horns or anything like this, but we did kind of call this out about a year and a half ago, or sorry, not a year and a half, but shortly after 01 was released, the first couple of repetitions of 03 was coming out. It's that seems to be steepening. I think this is actually happening. We're now seeing enough of these. I mean, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, we're in the roughly order of magnitude 10 points on this curve domain here. So that this, I think it may be real. Implications for AI capabilities, no one knows, but it suggests that whatever your timelines are for automated AI research, if you were on those timelines pre-01, probably need to update them to account for this new doubling time, if it's a thing.
Right, and the precise numbers are the averages on the 50% success rate is GPT 5.2 gets to 6.5 hours. Now, to be fair, the 95% confidence interval, which is to say the lower and upper bound of what this probably is, super big. It's 3 hours to 17 hours. So this is a hard thing to estimate. And again, tons of caveats. But given people's personal experience and this eval as well, not crazy thing to say that we are seeing increases at this thing.
And the error bars can be wide, but you can also just look at the trend, right? We do have about, 10, a dozen points now, all kind of on the same trend. So it's suggestive at a certain point, yeah.
Yeah, certainly you may not trust the exact numbers, but the trend is real.
Yeah, exactly.
And just a couple more things to cover in the alignment side. First, we've got some research from Anthropic. The hot mess of AI, how does misalignment scale with model intelligence and task complexity? So the gist of the result in this paper, they look at why things fail? Why does misalignment happen? And the bottom line of the paper is that when you get to longer and longer and more complex tasks, it's not that the models are misaligned. Like, the model isn't evil. The model just becomes bad at things and starts doing silly things. And so the misalignment is not from an intention of doing what it's not supposed to. It's more so an inability to do what it is supposed to, I guess you could say. And yeah, there's also some conclusions here with respect to larger versus smaller models, where, for instance, overthinking can mean that actually stronger models have this issue of going crazy in some sense, more so than that maybe less sophisticated models.
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to this idea of variance. So, run the same prompt through a model with a certain temperature, non-zero temperature setting, and you'll get different outputs. Basically, they're an attempt to kind of assess how crazy models can get, and how off base has to do with measuring that. How inconsistent and unpredictable are the errors that the models make, because this tells us something about the coherence of the goals that those models have. If the model had a really clear, coherent set of internal goals and a clear representation of them, it wouldn't vary that much, at least on tasks that it had been optimized for. And so what they find actually is, well, it takes a lot of effort to knock out the variance, to get these things to be on target in a consistent way. And we know that basically the argument of the paper is, look, you have to train LLMs in order to turn them into optimizers. You also have to train them to be aligned with human intent, and it's unclear which of those two things is going to be more robust as we scale these systems. It's just the case that you're going to see incoherence grow as reasoning length increases. So as these reasoning trajectories get longer, the amount of fluctuation and variance that you see in the outputs increases as well. That basically is a sort of metric for task complexity in a certain sense. The other thing that they find is this effect depends on easy versus hard tasks. So on easy tasks, the larger models, with more compute and all that, tend to have lower incoherence. They're simple tasks, so you get to a very clear solution on them if you deploy enough compute. But for hard tasks, bigger models actually lead to higher incoherence or even no improvement,